October 16th, 1793. Paris is still asleep, shrouded in a damp autumn fog, but in a cell in the conciergerie, the stub of a candle is already burning. A woman, sitting on a hard prison cot, slowly adjusts a worn cap. She's only 37 years old, but a casual observer would guess she was 60. Her hair, once shimmering gold, had turned white in a single night, as if death itself had touched it with its icy breath, leaving the seal of an inevitable end upon her brow. In the past, in that life that now seems like a sweet and agonizing dream, her mourning began with a ritual worthy of a goddess. Dozens of noble ladies schemed and fought for the sacred right to hand her a chemise. The choice was between Lyons silk, the color of dawn, and heavy, wine-colored velvet. But to understand how this woman ended up in a damp cell, we must rewind time.
38 years back to another palace, where the air was scented not with perfume, but with the smell of wax and cold statecraft. You are watching Personalities in Detail, and we are about to begin. November 2nd, 1755, Vienna, the Hofburg Imperial Palace. On this day, under the sign of Scorpio, Maria Antonia Josepha Johanna is born. She was the 15th child in the family, and her very birth was accompanied by an ominous portent. Her godparents, the King and Queen of Portugal, could not attend the ceremony. Why? Because in those very days, Lisbon had been wiped off the face of the earth by a monstrous earthquake that claimed tens of thousands of lives. Death stood by her cradle from the very first minute, but no one noticed this shadow behind the gleam of golden candelabras. Her mother was Maria Theresa, the great empress, a woman carved from marble and steel. She loved her children, oh yes, but she loved them with that terrible, functional love a general has for his elite regiments. For Maria Theresa, her daughters were not just girls dreaming of balls. They were currency. They were pawns on the giant chessboard of Europe, to be advantageously traded for the tranquility of the Austrian Empire. Little Antoinette, as she was called at home, grew up a charming but utterly wild flower. She hated books, was bored in history lessons, and could not focus on anything for more than 5 minutes. Her governesses wrote in despair that the Archduchess had the mind of a butterfly, light, fluttering, and utterly incapable of depth. But did that matter? She was not required to be clever. She was required to be obedient. Fate, that cruel playwright, was already preparing her role in a play whose finale would be written in blood. Smallpox, the ruthless killer of the 15th century, had taken her older sisters who were destined for the French throne, and so the turn fell to her, the 15th child, the girl who loved playing with pugs and sledding more than anything in the world. The union of the Habsburgs and the Bourbons, Austria and France, two age-old enemies who decided to seal a fragile peace with marital ties. This was not a wedding. It was a corporate merger, where Maria Antonia served as the letter of guarantee. Once the decision was made, the rigorous training began. Versailles did not tolerate imperfection. The French court is a terrarium where any flaw becomes a death sentence. And so the young Archduchess was assigned Abbé de Vermond to teach her to think like the French, and a dentist to teach her to smile like the French. Can you imagine this torture? Without anesthesia, in an 18th century chair, they literally reshaped her mouth, straightening her teeth so her smile would meet the standards of another country's taste. She endured the pain because princesses do not cry. Princesses prepare for slaughter. She was only 14 years old. 14. Think of yourself at that age. Now, imagine the responsibility for peace between two superpowers being placed on your fragile shoulders. On April 21st, 1770, a long procession of carriages lined up at the gates of the Hofburg. Vienna was bidding farewell to its daughter. Maria Theresa, that iron lady, cracked for a moment. She embraced her daughter, held her close, and whispered words that were meant as a blessing, but sounded like a curse. Be so good to the French people that they can say, I have sent them an angel. The Empress knew where she was sending her child. She knew the depravity of the French court, the weakness of the future husband, and the venomous tongues of Versailles. But politics demanded sacrifice. A cortege of 57 carriages, drawn by 300 horses, began its journey. Maria Antonia looked out the window, watching the spires of her native city disappear. She was riding toward the most brilliant court in Europe, toward a crown, toward adoration and hatred. But at that moment, she did not know the most important thing. She was not riding toward a husband. She was riding toward the scaffold, though the path to it would be paved with rose petals and take another 23 years. The journey lasted 2.5 weeks, and then, finally, the carriages stopped. Ahead, in the middle of the Rhine River, on a neutral island, a wooden pavilion had been built. This was her Rubicon, a place where Maria Antonia had to die so that Marie Antoinette could be born. And the ritual she was about to undergo inside that pavilion was as humiliating as it was important. On May 7th, 1770, a scene worthy of the pen of the Marquis de Sade unfolded on the island in the middle of the Rhine, though official chronicles called it the solemn ceremony of the bride's handover. This hastily erected wooden pavilion was divided into 2 parts. The eastern room symbolized Austria, the western, France, and in the middle, an empty space, a no-man's land. It was here that Maria Antonia had to undergo a ritual the court called the remise, but any psychologist today would call it an act of forced erasure of identity. The condition was absolute, cruel, and non-negotiable. Nothing Austrian was to cross the border. Not a single thread, not a single memory. Imagine this moment. A 14-year-old girl, weary from the long journey, enters a room where stern French matrons await her. They remove her heavy brocade dress, then her petticoats, corset, stockings, and chemise. She stands completely naked in the middle of the cold room, shivering not so much from the draft as from humiliation. Dozens of eyes scan her body, appraising the goods. Were her hips wide enough to bear an heir? Was her skin white enough to adorn Versailles? In that instant, she ceased to be a person. She became state property. But the cruelest blow was a small detail. As they began to dress her in all things French, from uncomfortable shoes to a dress cut in the Parisian style, she reached for her beloved dog, a pug named Mops. It was the only living thing connecting her to her home, her childhood, her mother. "It is not permitted, madame," the lady-in-waiting, Comtesse de Noailles, whom Antoinette would later aptly nickname Madame Etiquette, cut in with an icy tone. The dog was torn from her arms. Her Austrian maids, sobbing uncontrollably,
were pushed out the eastern door. The door slammed shut. Maria Antonia died in that room. From the western door emerged Marie Antoinette, a beautiful doll in golden wrapping, stripped of her past. On the French bank, the one for whom this grand spectacle had been staged was waiting. Louis-Auguste, the Dauphin of France. The contrast was devastating. She was the embodiment of grace, as light as a butterfly, with huge blue eyes and that elusive charisma that makes people turn their heads. He was a 15-year-old adolescent who looked older than his years due to an unhealthy stoutness. He was nearsighted, awkward, and shifted his weight from foot to foot. Louis-Auguste looked at his bride not with desire, but with fright. He had been raised in austerity and piety. Women frightened him, and this radiant foreigner seemed like an alien from another planet. He gave her a dry kiss on the cheek. There was no passion in that kiss, no promise of happiness, only submission to duty. They sat in the carriage to travel to Compiègne, where King Louis XV and the entire court awaited them. The crowd rejoiced. Peasants threw flowers under the wheels, shouting, "Long live the Dauphin!" not realizing they were cheering for the very person whose head they would demand 2 decades later. But silence reigned in the gilded carriage. Marie Antoinette tried to talk, to joke, to smile, but she met a wall of indifference. Her husband preferred to look out the window or study his buttons. He was bored. She was terrified. She did not yet understand that this coldness was not mere shyness. It was the prelude to one of the strangest and most agonizing marital lives in the history of European monarchies. A circle of thousands of courtiers was already closing in around her, each ready to tear her apart for the slightest mistake. She was surrounded by a crowd, but in that crowd, she was absolutely, cosmically, alone. And when the carriage passed through the gates of Versailles, the trap snapped shut. Ahead lay her wedding night, an event awaited by all of Europe, and one that was destined to become her first and most resounding failure. History knows few bedrooms as crowded as the royal bedchamber at Versailles on May 16, 1770. The wedding night of the heir to the throne in France was not an intimate sacrament for two, but a public act of state. The Archbishop of Rheims sprinkled the bed with holy water. King Louis XV personally handed his grandson his nightshirt. The Duchesse de Chartres handed one to the bride. The cream of the aristocracy stood along the walls, watching as 2 adolescents climbed under the heavy brocade canopy. The curtains were drawn. The court reluctantly withdrew, only to listen greedily at the doors. And in that moment, a silence fell that, defying all laws of nature and dynasty, would last for 7 long years. 7 years, 2,555 nights of humiliating, ringing silence. Louis-Auguste, that phlegmatic youth, simply turned on his side and fell asleep. His steady breathing became the only sound to disturb the peace of the first wedding night. Marie Antoinette lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, crushed by the realization of her own uselessness. She had been preparing for this moment her entire life. She was taught to please, to charm, to obey. But no one had taught her what to do with a man to whom she was indifferent. What was the reason for this catastrophe? Historians and physicians have debated this for 2 centuries. Was it phimosis, a painful physiological defect requiring a minor surgical procedure, or a complete psychological inhibition, a fear of women instilled by strict tutors? Just think, the fate of the Bourbon dynasty, the fragile peace between France and Austria.
perhaps even the revolution itself. All of it depended on a tiny incision from a scalpel that the king could not bring himself to undergo for 7 years. For 7 years he avoided doctors, preferring hunting deer to the hunt of love, and the people, unaware of the details, had already passed their verdict. The fault, of course, lay with her. The Austrian is barren, they hissed in the corridors. She is as cold as ice, they wrote in pamphlets. Meanwhile, letters flew from Vienna, stinging more than a whip. Maria Theresa, that great mother of Europe, showed no pity for her own daughter. "Where is the heir?" the empress demanded in every line, written in ink mixed with the poison of reproach. Beauty is nothing if the womb is empty. For Marie Antoinette, the onset of her monthly courses became a failure of the state. The entire court knew about her cycles. Laundresses examined the royal linens with a magnifying glass, reporting in the morning on the bloodstains that meant the collapse of hope for another month. What happens to the psyche of a young woman living in such a hell, humiliated in her own bedroom, rejected as a wife and unfulfilled as a mother? Psychology provides a cruel but accurate answer: sublimation. If energy finds no outlet in love, it erupts in a firework display of meaningless, dazzling activity. If Marie Antoinette could not become the mother of an heir, she decided to become the mother of amusements. If she was denied wifely happiness, she would take her revenge in feminine vanity. Versailles, that marble leviathan built by the Sun King, became not her home, but a stage where every gesture was scripted 100 years before her birth. You must understand what this golden fishbowl was like. It was a world where the right to hand the queen a glass of water was valued more than the talent of a general. Imagine the queen's morning toilet. Winter, the vast, poorly heated chambers. Marie Antoinette stands completely naked, shivering from the cold, waiting for her chemise. A chambermaid is already holding the garment, but the Duchesse d'Orléans enters the room. According to etiquette, the right to present the chemise passes to her. The chambermaid curtsies and hands the silk to the Duchess. But then, to everyone's horror, the doors swing open, and the Comtesse de Provence, the king's sister-in-law, enters. The hierarchy shifts again. The Duchess has no right to dress the queen in the presence of a member of the royal family. The chemise passes from hand to hand on its absurd journey, while the queen, arms crossed over her chest, turns blue from the cold. This was not etiquette. It was a sophisticated form of torture with a doll, elevated to the level of religion. And in this temple of hypocrisy, a truly dangerous enemy appeared for the 19-year-old girl, Madame du Barry, the last favorite of the old King Louis XV, a woman from the streets, a courtesan who had clawed her way into the royal bed through incredible beauty and a complete lack of principles. For the proud Austrian princess, raised with strict morals, du Barry's very existence was an insult. The court held its breath, awaiting a war. 2 women, one the embodiment of vice, but holding real power over the king. The other, the embodiment of purity, but politically helpless. Marie Antoinette chose the worst of all weapons: silence. She simply looked right through the favorite. It was a rebellion. Vienna panicked. Maria Theresa wrote furious letters. "You are jeopardizing the alliance between France and Austria over a whim." Ambassador Mercy pleaded, threatened, and wept, and the Dauphin relented.
The scene was worthy of Shakespeare's pen. A New Year's reception. The entire court, holding its breath, follows the Dauphine's every move. She walks past Du Barry, pauses for a second, just long enough not to violate propriety, but not to show warmth, and uttered a phrase that would go down in the history of diplomacy for its banality and its cost. There are a great many people at Versailles today. 7 words, just 7 words to prevent a war, but at the cost of her own humiliation. She felt broken, but it was at that very moment that the wheel of fortune took its fateful turn. On May 10th, 1774, the candle in the window of the royal bedchamber was extinguished. Louis XV had died of smallpox. And then something happened that Marie Antoinette would remember for the rest of her life. A terrible, growing rumble, like a clap of thunder. It was the stampede of hundreds of courtiers who, abandoning the body of the dead monarch, ran through the endless corridors to the chambers of the new ruler. The door burst open. The crowd fell to its knees. "The king is dead! Long live the king!" But instead of triumph, the young couple, embracing, wept. The 19-year-old queen and the 20-year-old king fell to their knees and uttered a prayer that sounds today like an epitaph for their reign. "O Lord, protect us. We are too young to reign." They had received the crown, but they had not received instructions on how to keep it on their heads. Power only slammed the door of the golden cage shut. She now belonged to the nation. Since she did not know how to govern a state, she decided to rule the only kingdom she held absolute power over, the empire of taste. And if France would not see her as a politician, France would see her as an icon. A woman entered her life whom malicious tongues immediately dubbed the Minister of Fashion, Rose Bertin. A commoner, a milliner whose hands smelled of fabric and pins, was granted the unprecedented right to enter the Holy of Holies, the Queen's private chambers, a place where even duchesses of the oldest lineages were denied entry. It was an unheard-of scandal. The Queen and her dressmaker would lock themselves away for hours, discussing not the fate of the nation, but shades of silk. Colors with absurd names like flea, Paris mud, or suppressed sigh became the law for all of Europe. Marie Antoinette's head transformed into a theatrical stage. In the most literal sense, the hairdresser, Leonard, constructed creations on her head reaching up to 3 feet in height. These were not hairstyles. They were architectural structures. When a French frigate won a naval battle, the Queen appeared at court with a model of the ship Belle Poule in her hair, bobbing on waves of powdered curls. On another occasion, an entire garden bloomed on her head, complete with mechanical birds and real vegetables. But did she ever consider how much flour was used for the powder on these Babylonian towers? While bread was beginning to disappear in the villages, the barbers of Versailles were dusting the heads of the aristocracy with tons of wheat flour. The whiteness of their wigs became a symbol of hunger for the rest of the country. However, Versailles, with its thousands of eyes and endless etiquette, still suffocated her. She needed a world of her own. And Louis, that kind but clumsy giant, gave her a gift that would prove to be a fatal one. He handed her the keys to the Petit Trianon with the words, "You love flowers, madame, so please accept this bouquet from me." The Petit Trianon, an elegant palace in the depths of the park, was where Marie Antoinette made her greatest political mistake. She hung a lock on the gates.
From then on, no one, not even the king himself, dared to set foot on this land without her personal invitation. Here she created her utopia, the Queen's Hamlet, an artificial pastoral idyll with a farm, a mill, and a dairy. The Queen of France would don a simple muslin dress, pick up a porcelain bucket bearing her coat of arms, and go to milk cows that had been washed beforehand and had silk ribbons tied around their necks. It was a game, a dangerous, insane game of simple life that cost the treasury millions of livres. She wanted to escape reality, but instead, she created a vacuum. By banishing the old nobility from the Trianon and refusing to observe the ancient rituals of etiquette, she made enemies more formidable than the street mob. Dukes and princes, deprived of the privilege of watching the Queen eat or dress, felt insulted. It was in the gilded drawing rooms of these rejected aristocrats, not in the dirty taverns of Paris, that the first poisonous pamphlets began to emerge. She thought she had found freedom in her toy paradise, but by locking the gates of the Trianon, she failed to notice that she had cut herself off from France. She ceased to be a queen for the nobles without yet becoming a mother to her people. While she played with lambs on perfumed meadows, the people in Paris had already started keeping score. And this bill was presented not in coins, but in hatred. When the sun set behind the gardens of Versailles, the pastoral idyll gave way to a fever of a different kind. Night blurred the lines between innocence and vice. The Queen of France, tired of her role as a shepherdess, sat down at the card table. The game was called Pharaoh. It was fast, ruthless, and required no deep intellect, only insane stakes. The green cloth became a battlefield where Marie Antoinette lost not just gold, but the remnants of her authority. In a single evening, 100,000 livres could vanish from her purse. Consider that figure, 100,000. A small French village could have lived comfortably on that money for 10 years. But in the stuffy halls of Versailles, saturated with the scent of wax and expensive perfumes, these sums dissolved in an instant, like sugar in hot water. The king, this frugal and modest man, sometimes tried to ban gambling at court. But what could a husband do who feared upsetting his wife more than bankrupting the treasury? She waved him away like a bothersome fly and continued to raise the stakes. And who gathered this golden harvest? A clique had formed around her, aptly nicknamed the Parasites by the people. At the center of this circle shone the Duchesse de Polignac, a woman with an angelic face, blue eyes in which the queen's soul drowned in the grip of a piranha. Marie Antoinette showered the Polignac family with favors bordering on state crimes, titles, estates, and pensions of 500,000 livres a year. For what? For the ability to entertain, for the illusion of sincerity. The queen was buying friendship, tragically failing to understand that loyalty is the one thing on earth that cannot be purchased with money. But amidst this pack of predators in silk and lace, a figure of a different caliber appeared. Axel von Fersen, a Swedish count, tall, silent, with eyes the color of northern ice. Was he her lover? Historians have been debating this question for 2 centuries. They scan the crossed-out lines in their correspondence with X-rays, trying to find the word love or a mention of physical intimacy. But does a physical relationship define the depth of a feeling? If the affair with Fersen was a secret kept by whispers and closed doors, the next act of this drama unfolded on the most brightly lit stage in Europe. It was an irony of fate worthy of the pen of an ancient tragedian. Marie Antoinette, who truly did spend millions on trifles, was destroyed by a crime she did not commit. She was guilty of extravagance, but her reputation was executed for a theft she knew nothing about. At the center of this storm was an object as monstrous as it was expensive, a diamond necklace. This was not a piece of jewelry, but a veritable shackling collar of 647 flawless stones, weighing 2,800 carats. The jewelers Boehmer and Bassange had spent years creating it, hoping to sell it to the old king's favorite, Madame du Barry. But the king died, du Barry was exiled, and the necklace remained, grotesque, heavy, and vulgar in its excessive luxury. Its price was 1,600,000 livres, a sum that could have equipped a fleet or fed Paris for a year. Marie Antoinette refused it twice. "France needs more ships, not more diamonds," she said, and this was perhaps the most sensible phrase of her entire reign. But the necklace, like a cursed artifact, sought a victim and found one in the person of Cardinal de Rohan. The Grand Almoner of France, Rohan was a man who was vain, wealthy, and incredibly foolish. He dreamed of becoming prime minister, but the queen despised him. And here, a genius of evil enters the stage. Jeanne de Valois Saint-Remy, an adventuress with the blood of ancient kings in her veins and the soul of a market vendor. She understood the main thing in Versailles: anything is possible if you know how to lie convincingly enough. Jeanne convinced the cardinal that the queen secretly longed to buy the necklace but could not do so openly because of the king's stinginess. She became the intermediary. She brought the cardinal letters, supposedly written by Antoinette's hand on paper bearing the fleur-de-lis. Rohan, blinded by hope, did not even notice that the Queen of France never signed her name Marie Antoinette of France. It was a glaring error that exposed the forgery, but the cardinal wanted to be deceived. The culmination of this phantasmagoria was a scene in the Grove of Venus in the gardens of Versailles. Imagine that night. Darkness, filled with the scent of jasmine. Cardinal de Rohan, trembling with excitement, falls to his knees before a female figure in white. The woman hands him a rose and whispers, "You know what this means." The cardinal is certain he is kissing the hem of the queen's dress. In reality, before him stood a milliner, Nicole Leguay, hired by the swindler for a pittance simply because her profile vaguely resembled that of the Austrian woman. A comedy of errors? No, a prelude to catastrophe. The necklace was handed over to Jeanne, crudely broken apart, and sold in pieces on the black markets of London and Paris. And when the jewelers came to the queen for their money, the abyss opened. Marie Antoinette, upon learning that her name had been used in a sordid scam, demanded a public trial. This was her fatal mistake. Pride blinded her. She believed that the truth was a shield, but she forgot that the court would not be judging the thief, Jeanne, but the monarchy itself. The trial turned into a show that all of Europe watched. Filth flowed like a river. The defendant's lawyers painted a picture of a depraved court where the queen arranges trysts with cardinals in the bushes and haggles over diamonds like a shopkeeper. And the people believed it. Why? Because the image of Madame Deficit was already seared into their minds. If she could lose hundreds of thousands at cards, why couldn't she steal a necklace? On May 31st, 1786, the Parliament delivered its verdict. Jeanne de Valois was sentenced to be flogged and branded with the letter V for voleuse, meaning thief. But Cardinal de Rohan was completely acquitted. Consider the meaning of this sentence. To acquit the cardinal was to admit that he had not insulted Her Majesty by thinking the Queen was capable of a secret rendezvous and fraud. The court officially declared, "The conduct of the Queen of France is such that any subject has the right to suspect her of anything." That evening in Versailles, no one celebrated. Marie Antoinette wept in her chambers, understanding that her honor had been trampled under the hooves of this mad carousel. And then a surprising transformation occurred. The woman accused of frivolity suddenly gained weight, the weight of grief. If the world had denied her love as a queen, she decided to seek refuge where titles do not matter, in motherhood. In the 8 years that had passed since that first wedding night, Marie Antoinette had given birth to 4 children, and this was no longer the flighty coquette who ordered dresses from Rose Bertin. This was a mother who, contrary to centuries of etiquette, personally oversaw the upbringing of her offspring. She gave up the endless series of balls. The Trianon ceased to be a place for parties and became a nursery. But fate is a cruel playwright, and she does not write happy endings for her heroines. The first toll of the bell sounded in 1787. Her youngest daughter, Sophie, died before reaching 11 months of age. There is one portrait by Madame Vigée-Lebrun from which a chilling cold emanates. In it, the Queen was supposed to be depicted surrounded by all her children. But while the painting was being created, little Sophie died. The artist had to paint over the child's figure, and on the finished canvas, Marie Antoinette sits next to an empty cradle. The void on the canvas became a gaping wound, a harbinger that this family would be wiped from the face of the earth. But the real hell broke loose 2 years later. Her eldest son, the Dauphin Louis-Joseph, the hope of the dynasty, was dying. He was only 7 years old. Tuberculosis of the spine was slowly and painfully twisting his fragile body. The child born to rule one of the greatest powers in the world could not even straighten his back without crying out in pain. Imagine the contrast. It is the spring of 1789. All of France is in turmoil. The Estates General are being convened. Politicians in Paris are shouting about liberty, equality, and a constitution. And in the Château de Meudon, in a dimly lit room, a woman in a simple dress sits by the bed of a dying boy, listening to his ragged breathing. On the night of June 4th, the Dauphin passed away. In any other century, the death of the heir to the throne would have plunged the nation into the deepest mourning. Churches would have tolled their bells, and people would have wept in the streets. But in 1789, the death of the Austrian woman's son provoked nothing but indifference. When a delegation from the Third Estate came to the king to discuss procedural matters, they demanded an immediate audience. The king replied that he was in mourning. The deputies insisted. Then Marie Antoinette, her eyes dry from tears shed, asked them, "Are there no fathers among the deputies of the Third Estate?" The question hung in the air, but no answer followed. The death of Louis-Joseph was not just a family tragedy, it was a moment of truth. The Queen realized that the nation had not just fallen out of love with them, the nation hated them. On May 4th, 1789, during the solemn procession of the Estates General,
This hatred took the form of an icy silence. Picture the scene: Versailles, bathed in sunlight, the king in a robe of gold brocade, the nobility in hats with white feathers, and the black, somber mass of deputies from the Third Estate. When the Duke of Orleans, the Queen's enemy, passed by, the crowd roared with delight. When Marie Antoinette appeared, pale but with impeccable posture, not a single clap was heard in response, only a silence more terrifying than any curse, and a lone shout from the crowd, "Long live the Duke of Orleans!" It was a slap in the face, and she knew it. The Queen nearly fainted, but held on. The mask of majesty had grown too firmly to her face. Then came July 14th, the day we have come to regard as the beginning of a new era. In Versailles, it began as an ordinary Tuesday. King Louis went hunting, but there was no game. In the evening, tired and disappointed, he wrote a single word in his diary: nothing. Think about that. At the very hour when the crowd in Paris was storming the Bastille, when the Governor de Launay's head was being cut off with a penknife and impaled on a pike, the King of France wrote nothing. This was not a sign of his foolishness. No, it was a symbol of the monstrous abyss that had opened between the monarchy and reality. When the Duc de la Rochefoucauld-Liancourt woke the king at night to inform him of the fortress's fall, Louis sleepily asked, "Is it a revolt?" "No, sire," the Duke replied with a phrase that has entered the history books. "It is a revolution." It was during these days that the most persistent and deceitful myth about Marie Antoinette was born. You have surely heard the phrase. It is quoted in schools, printed on T-shirts, and used as a synonym for a government's detachment from its people. If they have no bread, let them eat cake, or, in the original, brioches. Let me tell you the truth, she never said it. This phrase first appeared in Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Confessions, written when Marie Antoinette was still a little girl living in Vienna. She physically could not have uttered those words in 1789. Moreover, her correspondence from that time survives, in which she writes, "Seeing the people who suffer so much, we are obliged to work even harder for their happiness." But who was interested in the truth? Revolutions do not need facts. Revolutions need enemies. And Marie Antoinette, Madame Deficit, the Austrian woman, was perfectly suited for the role of the main villain. By the end of July, fear enveloped Versailles like a poisonous fog. The courtiers, the very ones who had fed from her hand for years, began to flee. The first to leave were her closest friends, the Duchesse de Polignac and the Comte d'Artois, the king's brother. They begged her to leave with them, to save herself while the borders were still open. She had the chance. The carriages stood ready. But here, on the edge of the abyss, the frivolous fashionista disappeared. The daughter of Maria Theresa remained. She refused to flee. "My place is beside the king," she said, "and beside my children. If the king is destined to perish, I will die at his feet." She stayed in the emptying palace, where at night the rumble of a distant storm could already be heard. She did not know that this rumble would soon turn into the tramp of thousands of feet. Paris was starving. Paris demanded bread, and an unseen hand was already directing the hungry mob toward Versailles. The beast had awakened, and it thirsted for blood. October 5th, 1789.
This day began not with a cannon shot, but with the beat of a drum struck by a young flower girl in a Parisian market. The sound carried over the Seine, more terrifying than any army. For when men go to war, it is politics, but when women march, it is a force of nature. 6,000 women marched on Versailles. Fishwives, market vendors, and laundresses, soaked by the autumn rain, armed with kitchen knives and spits, and among them, hiding their unshaven cheeks beneath skirts and bonnets, marched men with pikes. They came not to ask, but to demand. The baker, the baker's wife, and the little baker's boy, as they called the royal family. A 6-hour march through an icy downpour, knee-deep in mud. Picture the scene. The gilded gates of Versailles, behind which minuets were danced just the day before, and this dark, snarling mass, reeking of sweat, rain, and hatred. The king, true to his ruinous habit of yielding, received a delegation, promised bread, and went to bed. He believed the storm had passed. What naivete! Can one calm the ocean with words? Marie Antoinette did not sleep. She knew what her husband failed to understand. They had come not for bread, but for her. At dawn on October 6th, someone, a traitor or a fool, left a gate open. The mob flooded into the inner courtyard. From that moment, history turned into a slaughter. "Death to the Austrian! We'll make cockades from her guts! Tear out her heart!" These were not metaphors. The loyal Swiss guards standing at the Queen's doors were hacked to death on the spot, their blood staining the marble staircase. The Queen managed to leap from her bed just moments before the door splintered under the blows of axes. Half-dressed, stockings in hand, she fled through a secret passage to the king's bedroom, hearing the death cries of her defenders behind her. And then came the climax of this drama. Morning. The marble courtyard was filled with thousands of enraged people. They demanded the Queen. General Lafayette, the hero of two worlds, understood that if she did not appear, they would storm this part of the palace as well. Marie Antoinette stepped out onto the balcony. She held her children by the hand, her daughter and son. Below, a sea of pikes and muskets swayed. Hundreds of throats roared, "No children!" The crowd did not want pity. The crowd wanted a target. One twitch of a finger on a trigger, and it would all be over. What did she do? She led the children back inside and returned, alone. She stood at the railing, her arms crossed over her chest. She wore no armor, had no guards, only a simple dress and an absolute, almost inhuman dignity. Below, muskets were raised. The sights were aimed directly at her heart. She looked death in the face and did not lower her eyes. Seconds stretched into hours, and then a miracle occurred, perhaps the only one in this bloody epic. The courage of this woman, her readiness to die, disarmed the mob for a moment. The muskets were lowered. But history, that cruel dramatist, rarely allows for an intermission. From 1,000 throats a new cry erupted, a cry that became a sentence. "To Paris! The king! To Paris!" And so they went. It was not a royal procession, but a funeral procession for the monarchy, stretching over 6 long, agonizing hours. Imagine the carriage. Inside, suffocating from the dust and the stench of their unwashed escorts, sat the family that had ruled France just yesterday. Outside the window, the severed heads of their loyal guards bobbed on pikes as the crowd danced around them like a savage tribe. Marie Antoinette did not cry. She sat erect like a statue,
and only the whitened knuckles of her hands betrayed the turmoil within her soul. The Tuileries Palace greeted them with a tomb-like cold. No one had lived there for nearly 100 years, since the time of the Sun King. The vast halls were draped in cobwebs, the furniture had dried out, and drafts swept through the corridors like ghosts of the past. But the most terrifying thing was not the domestic discomfort, but the absence of silence. Their lives were now lived under glass. The gardens around the palace were open to the public, and any Parisian sans-culotte could walk up to the ground floor windows to spit on the glass or shout a curse at the Austrian. They had no personal space left. Even their bedroom doors did not close properly. Behind every curtain, a spy from Lafayette or the National Guard could be listening. It was here, in this gilded cage, that a remarkable metamorphosis took place. The frivolous fashionista who spent millions on dresses and feathers vanished. In her place stood a woman with a will of steel. While Louis XVI sank into apathy, spending his days reading the history of King Charles I of England, as if rehearsing his own execution, Marie Antoinette took action. She understood that salvation was in her own hands. By day, she played the part of a submissive constitutional queen, receiving delegations and smiling at her jailers. But at night, when the palace fell silent, she brought out ciphers and invisible ink. Lemon juice and milk. These were the weapons with which she tried to fight the revolution. She wrote to her brother, Emperor Leopold II. She wrote to Spain, begging for help. She wove webs of intrigue, attempting to bribe revolutionary leaders like the Comte de Mirabeau. "I have no strength left," she wrote in one letter, "but I must fight for my son's sake." Her beauty began to fade, but it was the fading of an ancient statue, which only grows more majestic with its cracks. Her eyesight weakened from constant strain and tears, but her inner vision became frighteningly clear. She saw what her husband did not. Compromise was impossible. The revolution was not a fire that could be extinguished with a bucket of water. It was an avalanche. In this impenetrable darkness, she had only one ray of light: Axel von Fersen, a Swedish count, her loyal knight, who loved her not as a queen, but as a woman. He mortgaged his estates and fell into colossal debt just to organize her escape. He was not afraid to return to Paris, risking his own head to personally prepare the rescue plan. They met in secret, snatching brief moments of intimacy amid the universal chaos. Fersen persuaded, insisted, and pleaded. On the night of the 20th of June, 1791, the Tuileries became a stage for the riskiest play of the century. The plot was simple: escape. But the execution was fatally overladen with details, as if fate itself had decided to mock their naivete. The queen, accustomed to the world revolving around her desires, could not imagine traveling without her usual comforts. Instead of light, fast carriages that could disappear into the night, a gigantic berline was commissioned. It was a veritable palace on wheels, drawn by 6 powerful horses. Painted dark green and yellow, it gleamed with varnish and was so heavy that it moved at the speed of a funeral procession. This was the first and most terrible mistake. Marie Antoinette fled not as a hunted victim saving her life, but as a queen embarking on a country outing. Inside the carriage, crammed with silver travel cases, wine, and changes of linen, the entire family was squeezed together. Etiquette, that
ancient idol they worshipped, even on the brink of the abyss, forbade members of the royal family to travel separately. This devotion to tradition became their death sentence. They were late. They were late everywhere. At every post station where they changed horses, the enormous carriage drew the attention of onlookers. The dragoons, positioned along the route by the Comte de Bouillé for protection, grew tired of waiting, lost patience, and left, assuming the king had canceled the trip. Precious time slipped through their fingers like sand. Louis XVI, phlegmatic even in a moment of mortal danger, insisted on stopping for full meals and walks, as if he did not understand that every minute of delay brought the scaffold closer. And then, cruel fate appeared in the form of Postmaster Drouet. In the town of Saint-Ménéhould, this man, whose name history should have forgotten, glanced into the carriage window. Legend says he compared the profile of the portly man inside with the profile on a 50-livre assignat. What a monstrous irony. The money minted to glorify the monarch became the instrument of his downfall. Drouet leaped onto his horse and galloped through the woods to cut off history's path. In the town of Rhine, just a few dozen leagues from the safety of the border, the bridge was barricaded with an overturned cart of furniture. The berline stopped. They were dragged from the carriage not as monarchs, but as fugitive criminals, and taken to the house of a local grocer named Sauce. Picture the scene. In a cramped room smelling of tallow candles and cheap cheese, among sugar loaves and barrels of herring, the fate of a 1,000-year-old monarchy was being decided. The king, ever the optimist, tried to embrace the grocer, assuring him he was merely traveling to Montmédy. Marie Antoinette, dropping her governess disguise, pleaded with the grocer's wife for help. But the woman merely replied that she was thinking of her own neck, not someone else's crown. The return journey to Paris became a way of the cross, lasting 4 days. Dust, heat, insults, and, most terrifying of all, the deathless silence of the crowd that met the carriage in the capital. The order was clear. Anyone who insulted the king would be flogged. Anyone who acclaimed him would be hanged. But this was only a prelude. The true finale played out a year later, on August 10th, 1792. That day, Paris awoke to the sound of bells. It was the sound that announced the death of the old world. The Tuileries was no longer a palace. It had become a besieged fortress. 20,000 armed sans-culottes, drunk on bloodlust and cheap wine, moved in to storm it. And here, in this moment of truth, the fatal difference in the couple's characters was revealed. Marie Antoinette, her eyes blazing, seized a pistol. She was ready to die on the throne, defending her right to be queen. She begged her husband to give the order to fire, to crush the rebellion with force. But Louis XVI, oh, that kind, unfortunate man, who all his life feared spilling a single drop of French blood, chose to flee to the protection of the Legislative Assembly instead of fighting. "We are not going to a refuge. We are going to the scaffold," the Queen retorted. But she followed him. As soon as the royal family left the palace, the floodgates of hell opened. 900 loyal Swiss guards, left without orders and without a commander, stood their ground. It was not a battle. It was a massacre. The mob, bursting into the gilded halls, hacked, stabbed, and threw people from the windows. The marble staircases, where the satin slippers of court ladies had stepped just yesterday, were now slick with blood. The guards' heads were impaled on pikes,
and their bodies were butchered right on the parquet floors. The monarchy drowned in red. The Tuileries had fallen. From that moment, they had no more names, titles, or privileges. They were moved to the Temple, a grim medieval tower with thick walls and narrow arrow-slit windows. King Louis and Queen Marie Antoinette disappeared. All that remained were citizen and citizeness Capet, prisoners number 1 and number 2. Life in the temple was a slow torture mixed with hope. They taught their children geography and Latin, mended their only set of clothes, and tried to ignore the guards who blew tobacco smoke in their faces. But history relentlessly demanded a sacrifice. In December, the king's trial began. He was accused of conspiring against the nation's freedom. The verdict was decided before the proceedings even started. Revolutions do not need arguments. They need symbols. On January 20th, 1793, Louis was allowed to say goodbye to his family. This scene breaks the heart even centuries later. The king wept, promising his wife he would see her in the morning before the execution. He lied. He left at dawn, without waking them, to spare them the final agony of parting. On January 21st, at 10:22 in the morning, the dull thud of a cannon shook the walls of the temple. Marie Antoinette, sitting in a frozen stupor, flinched. She understood everything without a word. The crowd in the Place de la Révolution roared, "Long live the Republic!" But look at what this woman does in her moment of greatest grief. She does not faint. She does not become hysterical. She stands up, wipes her tears, and slowly sinks to her knees before her son, before the 8-year-old boy cowering against her skirts. "The king is dead. Long live the king," she whispers. To her, he is now Louis XVII, the rightful monarch of France. She makes a deep courtly curtsy before him, acknowledging his authority in this prison cell. But history knows no mercy, only momentum. October 14th, 1793, at 8 in the morning. The Hall of Liberty in the Palace of Justice is packed to the rafters, like a cheap theater on opening night. The air is stale, heavy, saturated with the smell of unwashed bodies, cheap tobacco, and animal fear. The public thirsts for a spectacle. They have come not to see a trial, but to watch a beast being baited. They want to see the humiliation of the woman who, just yesterday, looked down on them from the balconies of Versailles. But when the doors open and the gendarmes lead in the accused, a strange, disappointed whisper runs through the hall. Where is that haughty Austrian who drank the blood of the people? Where is the monster in silks and diamonds? Before them stands a prematurely aged 37-year-old woman. She is dressed in a shabby black widow's gown. Her hair, once the envy of all Europe, is now carelessly hidden under a simple cap. She is deathly pale, emaciated from hemorrhages and prison rations. She is nearly blind in one eye. Yet this, too, drives the judges mad. She is not broken. She walks to the defendant's bench as if she were gliding across the parquet of the Hall of Mirrors. The revolution had taken her crown, her children, her husband, and her freedom, but it could not take her majesty. The interrogation begins. The public prosecutor, Antoine Fouquier-Tinville, a man with the face of a rat and the soul of a bureaucrat, reads out the list of crimes. It is not an indictment, but a phantasmagorical novel. She is blamed for all of France's woes over the past 20 years. Depleting the treasury, guilty. Passing military secrets to the enemy, guilty. Organizing orgies at the Petit Trianon, of course.
Fouquier Tinville expects an easy victory. He waits for hysterics, tears, pleas for mercy. He expects her to make excuses, get confused, lie. But Marie Antoinette chooses a different tactic. She answers quietly but firmly. Her voice, once clear and musical, is now hollow, but every word carries the weight of iron logic. To the charge of political influence over the king, she replies, "I was only a wife and a mother. I obeyed my husband in all things." It is a brilliant move. Under the laws of the time, a wife was not responsible for her husband's decisions. She dismantles the prosecution's arguments one by one, not with pathos, but with facts and common sense. The trial lasts for hours, and the longer the queen speaks, the quieter the hall becomes. The tricoteuses, the knitting women who sat in the front rows ready to spit in the tyrant's face, lower their needles. The unthinkable happens. The crowd begins to sympathize with the victim. They see before them not a political monster, but an unfortunate cornered woman bearing her cross with dignity. At one point, a juror even finds himself thinking that there is simply no evidence for a death sentence. The extravagances are unproven. The treason is based only on circumstantial evidence. Fouquier Tinville feels the ground shifting beneath his feet. The trial, intended as a triumph for the Republic, threatens to become a farce. If she is not condemned today, tomorrow the people might demand her release, and the revolution does not forgive weakness. They need her head at any cost. The political arsenal is exhausted. Logic is powerless against dignity. And so the prosecutors understand, to destroy the queen, they must first kill the woman and mother within her. A tense silence hangs in the hall. Fouquier Tinville exchanges a glance with Jacques-René Hébert, the editor of Paris's most vile newspaper. Hébert nods. He has an ace up his sleeve. The accusation is so monstrous, so boundless in its depravity, that nature itself should have recoiled at the words. They decided to play a card that had nothing to do with politics or finance. This would be a blow below the belt, a strike to the very heart. The judge leans forward. The candles are burning down, casting long, dancing shadows on the tribunal walls. The atmosphere grows unbearably tense. Words are about to be spoken that will forever stain not the Queen's honor, but the honor of those who dared to utter them. Hébert rises from his seat, holding a crumpled piece of paper. It contains the testimony of a child who had been plied with liquor and coerced into signing away his soul. Jacques-René Hébert gets up from the bench. In his hands is not a legal document, but a concentration of venom capable of corroding even stone. He begins to read, and each word falls into the silence of the courtroom like a clod of dirt on a coffin lid. This is the testimony of Louis Charles, the former Dauphin, now just a child broken in the Temple prison. Savoring the details, Hébert declares that Marie Antoinette, that Austrian she-wolf, did not merely betray France. He accuses her of teaching her 8-year-old son depraved acts. He accuses a mother of incest. The hall, accustomed to blood, screams, and curses, falls silent. This accusation is so monstrous that it transcends political hatred and enters the realm of ancient chthonic taboos. Even the most ardent revolutionaries, even the tricoteuses in the gallery, who usually knitted to the rhythm of the guillotine and bayed for heads, lower their eyes. Hébert,
has crossed a line. He wanted to humiliate the queen, but instead he has humiliated the revolution itself, revealing its bestial snarl. A heavy, suffocating shame hangs in the air. The president of the tribunal, sensing his control over the proceedings slipping, turns to the accused. "Do you have nothing to say to this accusation, citizeness?" he asks, hoping she will start making excuses, weeping and showing weakness. But Marie Antoinette does not cry. At this moment, an incredible metamorphosis occurs. The exhausted, half-blind woman in a black widow's dress, who has lost her husband, her crown, and her freedom, suddenly stands straighter. The widow Capet vanishes. The hated Austrian disappears. Before the judges stands a mother. Her face, moments ago ashen, flushes with the color of rage and supreme dignity. She scans the hall, not the judges, but the ordinary people sitting on the benches. "If I do not answer," her voice rings out, cutting through the stuffy air, "it is because nature itself refuses to answer such a charge laid against a mother. I appeal to all mothers present in this hall." It was a bolt of lightning, an electric shock that coursed through the crowd. The unthinkable happened. The women of Paris, the very market vendors who had marched on Versailles 4 years earlier to tear her apart, now applaud her. In that moment, they saw not a queen, but a sister in sorrow. A woman whose maternal heart was being trampled by the dirty boots of politics. Hébert sits down, crushed by his own villainy. Robespierre, upon hearing of it later, would smash a plate at dinner in a rage, declaring, "That fool Hébert, he has made her a martyr." But a moral victory could not stop the machinery of the terror. The jurors withdraw to deliberate. They are afraid. To acquit her would be to admit the failure of the entire system. It would mean facing the scaffold themselves. Fear proves stronger than conscience. The clock strikes 4 in the morning. The candles have nearly burned out, and in the dim light, the judges' faces look like death masks. The president reads the verdict. Guilty on all counts. The punishment, death. Marie Antoinette listens, standing, without a single muscle twitching. She does not beg for mercy. She does not look at her executioners. Her gaze holds the icy calm of a person who has already crossed the threshold of life. She knows this verdict is her liberation. There will be no more prisons, no more humiliation, no more separation from her children. She silently leaves the courtroom, leaving behind her accusers who, despite their victory, look defeated. She has only a few hours left to live, and she intends to live them in such a way that even her executioner will remember her not as a criminal, but as a queen. History moves inexorably toward its conclusion. October 16th, 1793 arrives, the day Paris will witness the final act of this great tragedy. Returning to her cell in the conciergerie, she does not go to sleep. There is no more time for sleep. Eternity is already at the door. At 4:30 in the morning, by the light of a candle stub, Marie Antoinette writes her final letter. It is addressed to the king's sister, Madame Elizabeth. In these lines, there is no hysteria, no hatred for her enemies, no complaints about her fate. "I am calm, as are those whose conscience is clear," she writes on cheap paper. She asks her children not to seek revenge for her death, and to remember that forgiveness is the only power available to the vanquished. This letter is one of the most poignant documents of the era, but the tragedy lies not only in its content, but also in the fact that it would never reach its recipient. The jailers would pass it to Robespierre, and it would lie under his mattress for years until Elizabeth herself went to the scaffold, never knowing the last words of love addressed to her. History can be cruel, even in its smallest details. At 7 a.m, the executioner, Henri Sanson, enters her cell. This is not the same gallant functionary who beheaded the king. The son has inherited his father's trade, but not his delicacy. The queen herself has removed her black mourning dress and put on a white piqué one, the color of mourning for French queens. But on this morning, it seems the color of innocence. Sanson roughly ties her hands behind her back. Then he takes a pair of scissors. Her hair, grayed and thinned by sorrow, falls to the dirty stone floor. It is the final act of physical humiliation, to deprive the woman who once dictated fashion to all of Europe of her main adornment. Now her neck is bare, ready. Unlike Louis XVI, who was allowed to ride in a closed carriage, Marie Antoinette is transported like a common criminal. She is placed in a dirty cart, a wagon for manure and the condemned, drawn by 2 heavy draft horses. She sits on a rough plank, her back to the horses, unable even to lean for support as her hands are bound. The journey to the Place de la Révolution takes more than an hour. Paris has poured into the streets to see the fall of the Austrian. The crowd roars, insults, and spits at the cart. The artist Jacques-Louis David, sitting by a window, makes a quick sketch. It shows not the beauty from the portraits by Vigée-Lebrun, but a prematurely aged, homely woman with sunken eyes and the scornfully pursed Habsburg lip. But she does not look at the crowd. She gazes over their heads into the autumn sky, as if she no longer belongs to this world. She will not give the rabble the pleasure of seeing her tears. The cart stops. Before her is the scaffold, and here, on the threshold of death, a scene occurs that no playwright could have invented, for it is too perfect in its simplicity. Ascending the steps, quickly, almost at a run, unlike her heavy-set husband, she accidentally steps on the executioner's foot. She stops. She looks at the man who will behead her in a minute and says, "Pardon me, monsieur. I did not do it on purpose." In these words lies her entire being. This is not irony or fear. It is an unconditional reflex of an upbringing that proved stronger than life itself. A queen is polite, even to those who kill her. At 12:15, the blade of the guillotine falls. The executioner holds up the severed head and shows it to the people. The crowd shouts, "Long live the Republic!" But it is a cry not of triumph, but of madness. Thus ended the life of Marie Antoinette. History played a cruel joke on her. She was a mediocre queen in times of prosperity, frivolous and extravagant, but she became great in times of trial. Suffering stripped her image of its superficiality, leaving only pure tragedy. She entered history not for her balls or political decisions, but for how she faced her end. She proved that you can take a person's crown, children, freedom, and life, but you cannot take their dignity. And if you ever find yourself in Paris, at the Place de la Concorde, where the guillotine once stood, close your eyes. Perhaps, through the noise of the modern city, you will hear a whisper. It will not be the false phrase about cake that she never uttered. It will be the quiet, "Pardon me, monsieur." A whisper of dignity that proves stronger than the fury of the crowd and sharper than the blade of the guillotine. History remembers her as a frivolous queen,
but in eternity she remains the woman who taught her executioners a final lesson in courtesy.